They say empaths are gentle, quiet souls, the healers, the listeners, the forgivers. But what happens when the one who absorbs everyone's pain finally reaches their breaking point? What if the person who always kept the peace suddenly walks away from the war, not in silence, but in power? Carl Jung warned us about this moment, the hidden rage of the empath, buried deep beneath layers of compassion and self-sacrifice. When that rage awakens, it doesn't just shake relationships, it burns illusions to the ground. Today, we're diving into what no one wants to talk about, the day the empath snaps. Why does it happen? What does it look like? And why did Jung call it one of the most dangerous transformations in the human psyche? If you've ever felt like you're one push away from snapping, or you've seen someone reach that point, stay with me till the end. This isn't just about empaths, it's about awakening. And if any part of this hits home, I want you to drop a comment like a truth bomb, and let your voice be heard. Don't forget to subscribe, not just for more, but because no empath should walk this journey alone. The calm before the storm. That's how most people describe empaths. Always quiet, always composed, always carrying the weight of everyone else's emotions like it's second nature. They're the ones who forgive when no one else would, who listen even when they're breaking inside, who smile so no one else feels uncomfortable. But what the world doesn't see, or chooses to ignore, is what Carl Jung tried to warn us about. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, silence is containment. It's pressure. It's the slow buildup of years of unspoken pain, betrayal, and emotional exhaustion. And the empath, for all their gentleness, is still human. They feel deeply, and sometimes, that depth becomes too much. They carry burdens that don't belong to them, hoping that by doing so, they can fix, heal, or make someone stay. But there comes a moment, and it's always quiet at first, when something inside shifts. It could be the final lie, the last manipulation, or just the unbearable weight of never being seen for who they truly are. And that's when the storm comes. Not with yelling or violence, but with clarity. The empath snaps, not into rage, but into truth. They stop explaining themselves. They stop absorbing pain that isn't theirs. They stop shrinking to make others feel comfortable. And in that moment, the person who was always overlooked becomes the one who is impossible to ignore. Jung understood this deeply. He spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we suppress in order to survive. For empaths, that shadow is often anger, resentment, the need to be heard, the desire to protect themselves. But suppress something long enough, and it doesn't die. It waits. The empath's shadow grows stronger every time they are dismissed, gaslighted, or guilt-tripped into staying quiet. And when it finally surfaces, it doesn't destroy, it liberates. It forces the empath to reclaim themselves. Relationships fall apart. Patterns break. The world around them may call it a meltdown, but for the empath, it's a breakthrough. And that's what makes it so dangerous, not because they lash out, but because they stop playing the role they were never meant to play. They stop pretending they are okay. They start speaking from wounds they were taught to hide. And that voice, calm, clear, powerful, becomes the very thing others fear the most, truth without apology. So if you've ever met someone who changed overnight, who went from nurturing to distant, from soft to strong, know this, they didn't just snap. They awakened. And when an empath awakens, they don't just free themselves. They shatter every illusion that kept them trapped. Jung's warning wasn't about fear. It was about respecting what lies beneath the surface, because the quietest person in the room is often the one carrying the loudest storm. The breaking point never announces itself with a scream. It comes in silence, a slow, almost invisible shift that no one notices until it's too late. The empath, who once gave endlessly, who smiled through tears and softened their voice to avoid conflict, begins to change. For years, they tolerated the disrespect, not because they were weak, but because they hoped love could fix what was broken. They absorbed the pain of others, carried it like it was their own, and kept choosing to forgive even when the wounds were still fresh. But there's only so much one soul can take. And one day, without warning, they stop. They don't shout. They don't beg. They just stop. That's the moment no one saw coming. The shift is subtle but undeniable. Their tone changes. Their eyes no longer seek approval. Their energy no longer bends to fit anyone else's needs. It's not bitterness. It's clarity. It's not revenge. It's self-respect. The empath turns cold, not to hurt others, but to finally protect themselves. That warmth that once comforted everyone, it becomes selective. That patience that used to make them the emotional dumping ground for others, it disappears. And the world, the very people who took them for granted, starts to feel it. The conversations aren't as soft. The favors aren't automatic. The understanding that once seemed endless, it now has boundaries. And those boundaries speak louder than words ever could. People start asking, "What happened to you?" As if they weren't the ones who caused the change. They'll call the empath distant, changed, or even heartless. But the truth is, this version of the empath isn't new. It's just a version that was buried beneath years of people-pleasing and silent suffering. Carl Jung spoke about the transformation that occurs when the shadow, the hidden self, finally comes to light. For empaths, this breaking point is that transformation. It's when the parts they silenced for so long, the anger, the exhaustion, the need to be seen, rise to the surface. And with that rise comes strength. You see, the empath doesn't want to become cold. But sometimes, the only way to survive is to stop bleeding for people who wouldn't even offer a bandage. And when that realization hits, everything changes. They no longer chase love. They no longer explain their worth. They don't entertain guilt trips or emotional manipulation. They become clear, firm, and self-protective. And while the world might mourn the loss of the ever-giving empath, what's actually being born is someone far more powerful, someone whole. So when the empath finally reaches their breaking point, it's not the end of their softness. It's the beginning of their balance. The shift might feel like loss to others, but for the empath, it's freedom. The kind they've always deserved. From the outside, the empath always looked like the healer, the one who soothed wounds, held space, and forgave things no one else would. Their kindness was mistaken for naivety, their patience mistaken for weakness. But Carl Jung would argue otherwise. He believed the empath wasn't just a vessel of compassion. They were a mirror, a reflection. And when that mirror breaks, it doesn't shatter, it turns, it flips, it stops absorbing and starts reflecting. And what it reflects isn't peace anymore, it's truth. Raw, uncomfortable truth. When the empath snaps, something inside them hardens. Not cruelly, but necessarily. They've spent so long tending to other people's wounds that no one noticed theirs were bleeding. They were the emotional sponge, soaking up anger, guilt, shame, quietly healing others while silently decaying inside. But every healer has a limit. And when that line is crossed, they don't just stop giving, they start showing, reflecting. They stop softening your harshness. They stop sugarcoating your manipulation. They stop rescuing you from your own reflection. Instead, they let you see it. All of it. The damage, the lies, the gaslighting, the selfishness, the abuse. The mask you wore so well now falls apart in their presence. Because the one person who used to soften your world now forces you to confront it. They say nothing, yet you feel exposed. They withdraw, and suddenly, you're alone with everything you've avoided. That's the power of the empath when they awaken. They don't scream. They mirror. And it's devastating, not because they hurt you, but because they finally let you feel the weight of what you've done. This is why losing an empath always feels like losing something spiritual. It's not just their absence. It's the absence of your own reflection, of the safe space they once provided. You're left with silence, and that silence echoes louder than any confrontation ever could. Because deep down, you know, the healer has become the mirror. And they are no longer trying to fix you. They've stepped back, not to punish you, but to reclaim themselves. To finally stop bleeding for people who watch them suffer. To finally say, no more. Not in words, but in energy. That's the kind of boundary that burns. So the next time an empath snaps, don't ask why they changed. Ask why they had to. Understand that their withdrawal isn't cruelty. It's clarity. And when they reflect your damage back to you, it's not vengeance. It's truth. Cold, clear, and long overdue. There's something haunting about the moment an empath awakens. Not in the way movies portray rage or revenge, but in the stillness, in the cold gaze that replaces the warmth you once depended on. That gaze doesn't burn with hatred. It doesn't scream or accuse. It simply sees you. Fully. Without illusion. Without hope that you'll change. It's the gaze of someone who has finally stopped lying to themselves. The softness that once healed you, held you, forgave you, it's gone. And in its place is something far more unsettling. Clarity. Carl Jung called it the moment the shadow steps into the light. It's when all the repressed emotions, the resentment, the hurt, the silent disappointments, come into awareness, not to attack, but to transform. The empath doesn't need to argue anymore. They don't need closure, explanations, or apologies. They've seen through the patterns. They've connected the dots. And the moment they do, their eyes change. The light in them doesn't die. It sharpens. And when they look at you, it's not with emotion. It's with knowing. That's what makes it so painful. Not just for you, but for them. Because empaths never wanted to reach this place. They loved deeply. They believed fiercely. They held on longer than they should have. Not because they were blind, but because they saw potential. But even the kindest hearts grow tired. And when they do, they don't lash out. They wake up. An awakening is not dramatic. It's quiet, cold, final. That gaze, the one that used to seek connection, now looks right through you. It sees the games, the manipulation, the patterns, and it no longer reacts. There's no anger left, only a knowing that no longer needs to engage. That's when you realize you've lost access, not to their love, but to their permission to affect them. The cold gaze of the awakened empath isn't revenge. It's revelation. It's the moment they step out of the role they never asked to play. The role of the fixer, the forgiver, the emotional shock absorber. Now, they choose themselves. Not out of pride, but out of necessity. And that choice changes everything. Because once the empath sees you clearly, truly, fully, they never unsee it. And from that moment on, your presence no longer holds the same power. The connection becomes a memory. The warmth becomes a lesson. And the coldness becomes freedom. Emotional severance is one of the most misunderstood forms of strength, especially when it comes from an empath. People expect empaths to always be available, always forgiving, always willing to try one more time. But what they fail to understand is this. The empath doesn't stay connected out of weakness. They stay because of hope. Hope that love can heal. Hope that change is possible. Hope that if they just give a little more, something will shift. But hope has its limits. And when it finally runs dry, the severance isn't loud. It's silent. It's clean. It's absolute. The empath doesn't shout or slam doors. They don't launch into arguments or chase closure. They don't need to. Because the most powerful thing an empath can do isn't scream. It's disconnect. Energetically, emotionally, spiritually. That invisible chord, the one that once pulsed with their constant care, forgiveness, and understanding, is cut. Just like that. And when it is, you feel it. Deeply. Because suddenly, there's no more emotional access. No more reactions. No more energy being poured into you. You become invisible to them. Not because they are punishing you, but because you no longer exist in their emotional field. It's chilling, isn't it? The person who once felt everything you felt now feels nothing at all when it comes to you. Their heart no longer flinches. Their eyes no longer soften. That warmth you took for granted becomes an echo. And it's not because they stopped caring overnight. It's because they cared for too long, until it drained them. They reached the point of energetic bankruptcy, and the only way to survive was to disconnect completely. Carl Jung would say this is the moment the self reclaims its power from the persona, the mask it wore to maintain the illusion of connection. The empath drops that mask. Narcissists thrive on control, not just over situations, but over people's perceptions, emotions, and reactions. And for years, the empath was the perfect match. Warm, open-hearted, deeply responsive. An emotional sponge who would absorb the narcissist's chaos, justify their behavior, and bend over backward to keep the peace. But the narcissist made one fatal mistake. They believed the empath would never change. They assumed the warmth would always be there, that the empathy was endless, that the supply would never run dry. But they were wrong, because when an empath turns cold, something terrifying happens. The narcissist loses control. Empaths warm rooms. They soften anger, ease tension, and make even broken people feel whole for a moment. But a cold empath, they freeze illusions. They strip the narcissist of their masks with nothing more than silence. And to a narcissist, silence isn't empty. It's exposure. It's a mirror with no distortion, no emotional buffering, no soothing words to soften the truth. It's raw, icy, real. That's what makes the cold empath so dangerous. They don't play the game anymore. They see it. And wise, they stop responding to it. To the narcissist, the cold empath is a nightmare. Not because they've become cruel, but because they've become immune. The usual tactics, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, love-bombing, bounce off like frost against glass. There's no reaction to manipulate, no weakness to exploit, no empathy left to feed on. The narcissist finds themselves alone with their own reflection, and it terrifies them, because for the first time, the empath isn't flinching. They are watching, detached, unapologetic, and free. This shift is subtle, but final. The narcissist can feel it. They sense the energy is gone, the emotional cords severed. Their supply, the constant flow of attention, emotion, and validation, has dried up, and what's left is a soul they can no longer touch, no longer confuse, no longer use. This is what they fear most. Not confrontation, not chaos, but disconnection. Because without the empath's emotional energy, the narcissist is forced to face something they've spent their whole life avoiding, themselves. And that's the tragedy for the narcissist. They never understood the empath's power. They only saw their softness, not realizing that behind it was a choice. A conscious decision to love, to give, to stay. And when that choice is revoked, there's no screaming, no door slamming, no final dramatic scene. There's just ice, pure, clear, and unbreakable. The cold empath doesn't hate. They don't seek revenge. They simply know better now. And that knowledge, that peace, is the one thing a narcissist can never manipulate. That's why they fear the cold empath. Because they realize, too late, that the real power was never in control. It was in connection. And once that connection is gone, so is their grip. Forever. The spiritual snap is not what most people expect. It doesn't come with chaos or screaming. It doesn't look like revenge or bitterness. In fact, it's eerily calm, like the eye of a storm that's been gathering for years. The empath, once soft and giving, finally reaches a moment of sacred detachment. This isn't rage. It's clarity. This isn't emotional instability. It's soul-level awakening. The empath doesn't lose control here. They regain it. And in doing so, they break free from a cycle they were never meant to carry. For too long, the empath poured themselves into the emotional wounds of others, believing that love could fix what trauma had distorted. They thought if they were just a little more patient, a little more forgiving, a little more quiet, things would change. But instead of healing, they found themselves shrinking, dimming, losing the thread of their own spirit while holding everyone else together. And when they snap, it's not to hurt anyone. It's to finally remember themselves. Carl Jung understood this moment well. The integration of the shadow, the reclaiming of the self from the illusions we were forced to wear. For the empath, the spiritual snap is the turning point. The moment they realized their love was never supposed to be sacrifice, their light was never meant to be currency, and their presence was never owed. It was a gift. The detachment that follows is sacred because it's not rooted in hatred, it's rooted in truth. A quiet truth that no longer needs to justify, explain, or fix. The empath doesn't argue anymore. They don't overextend. They don't plead to be seen. They see themselves, maybe for the first time. And that self no longer needs permission to walk away. This is what makes the spiritual snap so powerful. It's not a collapse. It's a rise. A rise out of the emotional trenches they were never meant to die in. A rise out of guilt, codependency, and self-forgetting. A rise into alignment, into boundaries, into peace. The narcissist, the manipulator, the emotional takers, they don't know what to do with this version of the empath. Because this version doesn't flinch, doesn't absorb, doesn't entertain cycles of harm disguised as love. The empath exits, not with noise, but with knowing. Not to punish, but to preserve. And when they go, they take their energy with them, their warmth, their healing, their presence. The space they once held is now empty, and that emptiness speaks louder than any goodbye ever could. The spiritual snap isn't about becoming someone else. It's about returning to who they always were, before the world taught them to forget. It's quiet, it's sacred, and it's final. Carl Jung's warning about the shadow wasn't just philosophical. It was prophetic. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the empath, that unconscious often looks like love. Deep, sacrificial, all-consuming love. But beneath it hides something darker. Unspoken wounds, childhood conditioning, a pattern of tolerating disrespect under the illusion of being kind. And when the empath snaps, it's not a breakdown. It's the moment their shadow rises, and they stop calling their pain love. For years, the empath believed they were being loving by staying quiet, forgiving endlessly, and absorbing the chaos around them. They wore the mask of the healer, the peacemaker, the one who always understood. But that was never the full picture. What they didn't see, what Jung warned of, was that their unconscious was running the show. Unhealed beliefs about their worth. A deep fear of abandonment. The idea that love means sacrifice. These hidden forces shaped their choices, their relationships, their entire emotional reality. And they called it fate. They called it compassion. But it was something else. Survival. When the empath snaps, it's because the shadow, all the pain they repressed, all the anger they swallowed, all the truths they denied, finally demands to be seen. It rises not to destroy, but to reveal. The empath begins to see clearly that what they accepted wasn't love, it was manipulation. That what they tolerated wasn't strength, it was self-abandonment. That the roles they played were never chosen freely. They were inherited, unconsciously. This is the moment of awakening. The moment they stop confusing loyalty with emotional slavery. The moment they no longer find pride in being the one who always stays. The shadow comes forward, and it brings truth. Painful truth, but liberating truth. The empath begins to reclaim the parts of themselves they locked away. Their voice, their rage, their right to be seen without being used. And once they taste this clarity, they can never go back. People around them may say, "You've changed." But the truth is, they are finally becoming. They are integrating, no longer ruled by unconscious patterns. They begin to live from awareness, They make new choices, not to please, but to honor their spirit. They walk away from what drains them. They stop justifying the bad behavior of others. They no longer romanticize pain. Jung's shadow work is not about becoming darker. It's about becoming whole. And when the empath finally confronts their shadow, they don't lose their light. They deepen it. They no longer shine to be loved. They shine because they are awake. And that shift, that is the most powerful thing an empath can ever do. The silent goodbye is one of the most powerful exits an empath will ever make. And yet, it's the one no one ever sees coming. There are no warnings, no drawn-out explanations, no tearful confrontations. Just silence. A quiet withdrawal that echoes louder than any argument ever could. It's not meant to wound, though it often does. It's not meant to create confusion, though it leaves many stunned. Because when an empath chooses to leave silently, it isn't about revenge, it's about self-respect reawakened. For so long, the empath stayed. Through the lies, the emotional roller coasters, the subtle disrespect that slowly chipped away at their sense of self. They kept hoping, kept loving, kept giving, believing that if they were just a little more understanding, things would change. But change never came. Only more taking. And empaths, though deeply compassionate, are not infinite wells. They run dry. They wake up. And when that awakening happens, there's no dramatic scene. No accusations. Just a soul that's quietly done. You don't get a message. You don't get a final plea. You just feel the absence. The phone doesn't ring. The text doesn't come. The warmth is gone. And you're left with a silence that doesn't beg to be broken. It demands to be understood. This is the kind of goodbye that hurts more than anger. Because it's not emotional, it's energetic. The connection has been severed. The cord cut. You've lost access, and you don't even know when it happened. The empath no longer needs closure, because they've given it to themselves. They no longer seek to explain why they are leaving, because finally, they realize they don't owe that to anyone. Carl Jung understood this deeply. The moment a person stops projecting and starts integrating, they reclaim their power. The silent goodbye is that reclamation in motion. It's not coldness, it's clarity. Not a wall, but a door. Quietly closing so healing can begin on the other side. And while the world may call it heartless, the empath knows the truth. It took more strength to walk away in peace than it ever did to stay and fight for what was never real. Because the final act of self-love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the whisper that says, "No more," and walks away without looking back. The return of the true self isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or grand declarations. It unfolds quietly, like a fog lifting after years of emotional confusion. The empath, long buried beneath layers of pain, people-pleasing, and self-sacrifice, doesn't become someone new. They return to who they were before the emotional damage began, before they learned to dim their light to make others comfortable, before they were taught to confuse love with suffering. This return isn't about rebellion. It's about remembrance. For years, the empath wore the role of the rescuer, the fixer, the forgiver, the one who made excuses for others while silently bleeding inside. They were the emotional anchor in other people's storms, even as their own ship was sinking. But something eventually shifts. It's not triggered by a single moment. It's a build-up. The soul grows tired of performing. The heart grows weary of giving without receiving. And the spirit, the part that was always watching, always waiting, finally speaks. This isn't who we are. That's when the empath begins to peel back the layers, the false roles, the survival masks, the conditioning. One by one, they shed the beliefs that told them their worth was found in how much they could endure. They stop rescuing people who refuse to swim. They stop watering gardens where nothing grows. And they begin to speak, not to convince, but to reclaim. They become truth-tellers, not in a harsh way, but in a grounded, unshakable way. Their voice, once soft and hesitant, now carries weight. And they no longer fear being misunderstood, because they no longer seek permission to exist. Carl Jung believed that wholeness was the goal of life, not perfection, not peace at any cost, but integration. That's what this return is. The empath no longer splits themselves into pieces to keep others comfortable. They embrace the fullness of who they are, the light and the shadow, the nurturer and the protector, the heart and the boundary. People around them might not understand the change. Some will say, "You're not the same." And they are right, because the empath has finally stopped being who the world told them to be, and started being who they truly are. Strong, awake, whole. This return isn't a moment. It's a homecoming, a sacred reunion with the self that always existed beneath the pain. And from that place, the empath no longer seeks to be everything for everyone. They simply are. And that, in itself, is more than enough. Cold is misunderstood. People see it as cruel, distant, even heartless. But for the awakened empath, cold is simply clarity. It's the shedding of confusion, the ending of emotional chaos, the refusal to be dragged into endless loops of manipulation disguised as love. When the empath becomes cold, they aren't losing their humanity, they're reclaiming it. This coldness isn't emotional numbness. It's emotional intelligence,